We had mentioned the question of the young rich man and of the lawyer to Jesus Christ when they asked him, "What must I do to have everlasting life?" And we had been giving the answers of Jesus Christ as found in the Gospels. And today we shall find out what is Christ's answer from the Gospel to the same question, as taken from the sixth Sunday in Ordinary Time. And therefore the question, "What must I do to have everlasting life?" Christ answers that you have to have a righteousness that surpasses the righteousness of the Pharisees and the scribes. Now, what does this mean? Well, you see, the scribes and the Pharisees are living in the Old Testament, and so they were following the Ten Commandments of God as enumerated in the New Testament. And Christ says, in order to go to heaven, it's not enough for you to imitate the Pharisees in simply obeying the Ten Commandments of God in the Old Testament. You have to obey also the commandments of Jesus Christ as enumerated in the New Testament. Besides, you know very well that the Pharisees and the scribes were teaching the Ten Commandments but were not obeying them. And so Christ says, well, at least if you want to go to heaven, you should teach the Ten Commandments like the Pharisees and the scribes, but you should also obey them, which the scribes and the Pharisees were not doing. And so now the message of Jesus Christ for those living in the New Testament, which is the Catholic Church, should be, it's not enough for us to obey the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament to enter the kingdom of heaven. We have to obey the commandments of the Old and the New Testament. However, Christ was giving the impression to the Pharisees and the scribes that he was abolishing the Old Testament commands while introducing the New Testament commandments of Christ. And this is not so, and Christ said so. What Christ was doing was that he was perfecting the commandments of the Old Testament into the more difficult and the more perfect commandments of the New Testament. And so St. Thomas of Aquinas wrote that it is enough for us to obey and to know the commandments of the New Testament, because in knowing and obeying them, we would know and obey the commandments of the Old Testament at the same time. So there you have the New Testament commandments is what is necessary for salvation, because when you obey them and you learn them, you learn and obey the commandments of the Old Testament at the same time. Now, if you will notice in the Gospel of St. Matthew today, 6th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Christ gives us several commandments, not only one, several commandments that we must do in order to attain everlasting life. He gave the first one in that we have to obey the commandments of the New Testament, which is the perfection of the commandments of the Old Testament. But why does Christ give so many commandments of the New Testament in today's Gospel? Why doesn't he give it one by one, as he had done in other Gospels? And the reason is this. St. Thomas of Aquinas says, Just look, for instance, in a runner, one running in a contest. Usually he runs slowly at the beginning, and then when they are approaching the goal or the end, the final, they begin to run faster. And the reason is because if they are lagging a little bit, then they can make up for what they have failed to do and keep up their pace to win the race. And so the same thing what happens in the spiritual life. When we are running towards perfection, when we are about to see the goal and the end, we have to hurry up. Why? Because we might die before we leave the end line and therefore not make it, not win the contest. And therefore, even if it kills us, we have to rush to the finish line and try to win the race. And it is for this reason precisely that Christ gave us several commandments of Christ in this gospel on the sixth Sunday in ordinary time to hurry us up. So just in case we die this week without reaching the seventh Sunday in ordinary time, we would have accomplished some more of the commandments of Christ and probably be more deserving to go to heaven, or at least go to the colder part of hell. So let us look at the commandments that Christ has told us. And the first commandment in today's gospel is that we should obey the commandments of the New Testament. And the commandments of the Old Testament is not sufficient to save your souls. If obedience to the commands of the Old Testament is not enough for salvation, how much more if you are disobeying the Ten Commandments, like committing adultery, like telling lies, or stealing others' property, and so forth and so on. So there you have. And so the second command of Christ is, he said, precisely to show us that the New Testament commands are superior or perfection of the Old Testament. Christ says, in the Old Testament it says, "Thou shalt not kill." In other words, in the Old Testament, you're not supposed to take the life of another person. Thou shalt not kill. And then Christ says, but in the New Testament, it's different. Not only are you not allowed to kill, you are not even allowed to be angry at your brother. And for Christ, therefore, to be angry without cause, the gospel says. If you are angry at your brother without cause, you have committed murder. And so, it is clear that we may get angry with a cause. And the only valid cause for being angry is when someone has committed sin. When someone have disobeyed God, we must get angry to inform them that they had disobeyed God. By our anger, we show them and hopefully be able to encourage them to repent. So what is this sinful anger? St. Thomas of Aquinas describes 3 degrees of anger, one more serious than the other. The first degree of anger is when it comes from your passion, because somebody hurts you, somebody insults you, somebody does some injustice to you. The first reaction is anger. It is an emotion, pure emotion. And St. Thomas says that's not so bad, because that is a first reaction. It is natural for man to have the first reaction of anger when somebody does something evil against him. But it is anger, but it is not sinful. Secondly, if this initial reaction comes out externally in the form of words, like Christ says, if you say raka, which is an interjection showing externally the anger that is within you. Now this time, it is a sin, more serious sin. The first one is not even a sin, but the second one is a sin. The third degree of anger is when you actually not only say something externally, showing the anger that is within you, but when you actually insult or hurt the other person. In which case, Christ says, it is equivalent to murder. So there you have the New Testament command of Christ, which is more difficult than the Old Testament command of Christ. And because it is more difficult, we need grace in order to know, to understand those commandments, and more so we need grace in order to obey those commandments. Then Christ continues to tell us what we must do to have eternal life. He says, in the Old Testament, it says you shall not commit adultery. And adultery in the Old Testament consists in actually getting the wife of your neighbor. That is adultery in the Old Testament. Getting your neighbor's wife for yourself. That is adultery. Then Christ says, well, in the New Testament, it's not going to be as easy as that. Because in the New Testament, you just look with your eyes at another's wife and desire for that wife, and you have already committed adultery in your hearts. Again, let us look at the 3 degrees of the movement of the heart. If you look at another's wife, there will always be that initial natural reaction to desire another's wife. It's natural. And so it is not a sin. However, if that idea is not in your intellect and you begin to have pleasure and plans how to satisfy that pleasure with your neighbor's wife, it becomes more serious sin. It is a sin, more serious than the first, because the first one is not a sin at all. But the moment you reach the third step, wherein you actually make plans to satisfy your pleasure with the wife of your neighbor, then Christ says you have already committed adultery with her. See how serious it is. In the New Testament, the commandments that Christ had given us. That's the reason why we need much graces to understand, just to understand those commandments. Much, much more so, we need more graces to obey them because they are more difficult. You might object that since it is more difficult to obey the commandments of the New Testament, then we have excuse to violate those commandments. Well, in the Old Testament, there was no grace, and so it was understandable that people were disobeying the commandments of God in the Old Testament and committing adultery. But in the New Testament, we have graces. We have helps from God to be able to overcome all those temptations. And so we have no excuse not to obey those commandments of the New Testament. And then Christ continues and gives us a command of the New Testament that is so much violated today. Christ says, whenever a man divorces his wife, he must give her a decree of divorce. What I say to you is, everyone who divorces his wife, lewd conduct is a separate case, forces her to commit adultery. Now, this is a command that's very difficult to interpret, and everyone without grace, most of the priests, most of the bishops who are without faith, cannot interpret this command correctly. Because every commandments of the New Testament, we need faith to know them, to interpret them correctly, and we needed more grace in order to obey them correctly. Now, the Gospel says that Moses in the Old Testament allowed divorce. Yes, Moses allowed divorce. But notice he said that when the divorce is being worked on, a rescript is being made to declare the divorce. The husband and the wife must live together and wait for the divorce bill, the bill of separation to be written down and given to them. And that's the only time they are allowed to divorce. Now, why did Moses allow divorce? And Moses said so because of the hard-headedness of the Jews. You see, the Jews were the chosen people of God. But during that time, they have just been enslaved by the Egyptians. They have stayed there for a long, long time, and now God had allowed them to be free from their slavery. And so the Jews were Jews in their belief, but Egyptian in their practices of marriage. And therefore, for the Jews during that time, whenever they didn't like their wives, they would kill them. They would kill them. And in order to protect the wives, Moses allowed divorce to prevent the killing of husbands of their wives that they no longer like to have. That was the only reason. It was not to encourage separation of husband and wife. Moses did not like that. He said so. It's only because of your hard-headedness. Moses simply wanted to protect the wives so that they would not be murdered by their husband. But notice that Moses gave a prescription wherein a bill of divorce had to be written before the husband and the wives can be divorced. A prescription of divorce. What was the idea behind this rescript or a prescription of divorce? Well, a secretary had to write that rescript down. And during that time, it takes a long time for a secretary to write it down. Pens were not available, inks were not available. The rescript formula is very difficult to write down, and there were very few secretaries. So the idea behind it is that since it took the secretary such a long time to write down the rescript of divorce, the husband and the wife who are supposed to live together might have time to think things over and decide to give up divorcing each other. So the purpose of Moses for demanding a rescript of divorce was in the hope that the couples might postpone and completely give up the divorce. So what is the New Testament rule on husbands and wives who would like to divorce? And Christ says, no way. As long as both are validly married, they should stay with one another. They should stay with one another. No one should give the other away. And that is a very clear demand and commandment of Christ in the New Testament. Meaning to say, our religion is a religion that commands that we should love our enemies. How can you love your enemies if you cannot even love your husband or your wives? Our religion teaches peace and goodwill. Why should we allow a quarrel to destroy the family? So no way, no husband or no wife should give anyone away. And so the fathers of the church says, you should grow in spirituality if there is something wrong in your marriages. And the way to solve any problem in marriage is grow in spirituality, grow in faith, grow in charity. The reason why both of you cannot bear one another is lack of charity and lack of faith. In which case, no matter what you do, as long as you lack charity and faith, both of you are going to hell. There is no solution to your marriage if the problem is the lack of charity and the lack of faith. And so the fathers of the church says, whatever problems you have, stay together. Even if the family life has become unbearable, live in separate rooms, but live together. Do not lay each other aside, because Christ says, if you lay your husband or your wife aside and he or she commits adultery, you who have laid them aside is equally guilty of adultery. And whoever mentions your husband or marries your husband and wife whom you have set aside will also be guilty of adultery, even if they're single who marry them. There you have the only way to preserve the Catholic family. Any problem between husband and wife is always a problem of faith and charity. So solve the problem of faith and charity. In other words, be better Catholics. Know and obey more the commandments of Christ in the New Testament. That is how to solve family problems. But in the Catholic Church, you never set aside your husband and wife when you have problems. You cannot, because you are causing them to commit adultery. Their sins will also be your own sins.